Hello, Yahoy. Can you hear me? Audio sound good? How's everybody doing today? Let me know if the volume is okay. I can turn it up. If not, for those of you in the chat box, I will be monitoring the chat box. So yeah, my name's John Bush from Austin, Texas, born and raised. I'm the executive director of Texans for Accountable Government. It's a political action committee based out of Central Texas. I'm also the education director for the Foundation for a Free Society. MyFreeSociety.com is the website for that. You can check out Texans for Accountable Government. That's the website for the Political Action Committee. I also helped to co-found Operation Defuse, an effort to push back on the police state, the fusion centers, the Department of Homeland Security, along with Catherine Bleish. Just general activism. My ultimate goal is to create a genuine, free, and prosperous society that everyone can enjoy. And there's multiple avenues that I'm doing that with. The Foundation for a Free Society, our mission is to educate, activate, and liberate, to educate people about the philosophy of liberty, to activate them to take action, to spread the message of liberty, impart them, give them tools in order to more effectively communicate and influence people and win them over to the cause of liberty, and finally to encourage them to liberate themselves, to live according to their inherent natural rights as sovereign free people, growing their own food, becoming self-sufficient, competing in counter currencies, counter economies, learning self-defense, growing free community and free societies. Educate, activate, and liberate. This particular portion of the speech, or this particular speech and talk I'm going to be giving today will be dealing with the activate portion of our mission, educate, activate, liberate, and I'm going to give some tools and strategies on how to more effectively communicate the philosophy of liberty and how to win people over to ideas of liberty. And in order to illustrate this, I'm going to do a throwback to a classic Texans for Accountable Government activist mantra philosophy that we had, and that's humanize, harmonize, localize. I like the three-part rhyming, educate, activate, liberate, humanize, harmonize, and localize. Humanize means get out from behind the computer, unless you're checking out agora.io, and shake your neighbor's hands. Meet with people in person. Go to community events. Meet with your elected representatives. Meet with local law enforcement. Look them straight in the eye. Let them know that you're out there. Speak with people, grow community. They're trying to dehumanize us, trying to push us away from, they're trying to destroy community, trying to destroy family, and we need to rehumanize. And it's the best way to connect with people because you can do it on a human level and you can feel people's energy and you can share energy and you can more effectively reach them and talk to them. The second aspect is harmonize. Humanize, harmonize, and harmonize is going to be the key focus on the discussion today. The title of the discussion, is perhaps I should have began with, is the Carnegie effect, harmonizing with the left and right. Harmonization is all about setting aside your differences and working together on common areas of interest. For libertarians, these areas of interest, of course, we're trying to create a free society, and we want to have as much individual liberty as possible. We believe in the non-aggression principle, decentralization, property ownership, although that's debated, self-ownership I would hope to begin with, and you'll find that there's still aspects and there's still little semblances of those ends that we seek in the modern left and right, modern liberals and modern conservatives. The talk, again, the Carnegie effect, harmonizing with the left and right, will delve into how to win friends and influence people. Dale Carnegie wrote this book, it must have been back in the 30s or 40s, and basically he lays out strategies on how to speak with people so as not to arouse any resentment, to speak in terms of their interest, to speak in a manner that's non-argumentative, but really you're seeking to further their goals. He goes over lots of different tips and tactics. I've given a lot of these books out to people. I've read it several times myself. You can find it at your local bookstore or used bookstore, swap meet, on Amazon.com even, for very inexpensive. It goes for like $2 or $3. Get it, read it. If you really like it, buy it and give it to people. Spread the word. But we're going to be talking about one of his specific recommendations, which is to speak in terms of other people's interests so as not to arouse resentment. And I'm going to give you tools and tactics on how you can do that when speaking with left and right individuals, modern liberals, modern conservatives, so you can help to further libertarian ends. And that's really what harmonization is all about. We build single-issue coalitions down here in Central Texas with Texans for Accountable Government. Right now we're working on a fusion center reform bill that's going to be heard this Wednesday that would prohibit fusion centers from collecting non-criminal information of a political, religious, social nature. Also, they can't collect information on your associations or military history. It would also stop biometric information from being collected, as well as personally identifiable information, and to really throw a kink in the FBI's NCIC database, where they're going to be going after your fingerprints. Well, they already got your fingerprints. I'm sorry. They're going to be going after facial recognition and iris scans. So we're going to jam them up, but the beauty of this issue is you can appeal to the left and right, and the left and right is being appealed to because the state has been abusing both of them equally. Same thing with the TSA body scanners and a whole multitude of issues. You unite both sides, all the while undermining their belief that the Democratic and Republican paradigm is a viable vehicle to further their ends. And we can demonstrate to them that the market and other things, I'll get into that. That's what harmonization is all about. And finally, so it's humanize, harmonize, localize. Localize is all about decentralization. The principle of subsidiarity, it arose from the Catholic Church. It basically states that authority should be vested at the lowest, most local possible level and should radiate outwards. So it should start at the individual, then the family unit, then the community, your peer group, coworkers even maybe, then a township, municipality, whatever type of society our ideal free society might be, city-states, then county, state level, national, international. It should always start with the individual, and if you ask me, it should stop there with you and your family and your community. Everything else is just hogwash, and whenever we vest too much authority in those levels, we inevitably lose our freedom at the local level. But that's why people should participate in local politics if they choose to, and if not, focus on local community building in order to create a more free society, because it starts at the individual level. We have more power, we have greater influence, greater leverage. We're more efficient and more effective when we operate at the local level, be it within the political paradigm or without the political paradigm. And besides, that's consistent with the libertarian philosophy of decentralization of authority and of power, all the way, again, down to the individual. So that's humanize, harmonize, localize. Today we'll be focusing on the harmonization aspect. So this is some work that I've been doing with the Foundation for a Free Society, and it's great to be able to give this talk. We'll be later putting it down and recording it in other fashions as well as releasing some posts and articles about this and really fleshing it out. Because there's so many different ways that you can go to help your activism with the How to Win Friends and Influence People, the Carnegie method as I call it, the Carnegie effect. But today we're going to be focusing on speaking in terms of their interest. So, the greatest way to influence another individual to the cause of liberty, especially if they're not necessarily libertarian or on the same page as you, is to appeal to their interests, to speak in terms of their interests. They're not concerned with what you care about. They don't care what your ends are or what your goals are or what you're trying to do for the most part. They're concerned with what they're trying to do, with the society they're trying to build, their ideal, right? So today, when entering into political discussion, philosophical discussion, ideological discussion, I call on libertarians to appeal to those aspects of modern liberalism and modern conservatism that are still in line with the philosophy of liberty. Property, self-ownership, decentralization, consensual government is another one of those ideals. So you'll find that there's still elements within modern liberalism and modern conservatism that are almost wholly in line with libertarianism. And we're going to explore those, and I'm going to impart some different tactics and techniques and speaking rhetoric that you can use in order to appeal to the last semblances, the little inner libertarian that still lies within many modern liberals and modern conservatives. Okay, so let's start with liberalism, because liberalism is closer to libertarianism after all. Modern liberalism has its roots, as does libertarianism, in the classical liberal days, in the classical liberal revolutions of the 17th and 18th century, starting with the English Civil War on to the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. The ideals of John Locke, of Frederick Bastiat, or Bastiat, or however you want to say it, of Thomas Jefferson, and other Enlightenment thinkers, the redawn of the Age of Enlightenment was turned into some pretty libertarian stuff, some libertarian revolutions for the most part, even though they still conserved the monopoly on privilege that the crown, at least it was decentralized. But, to illustrate this idea of liberalism being united with libertarianism, there's a great piece that I strongly recommend everybody reading, and it's Murray Rothbard's Left, Right, and the Prospects for Liberty. He wrote it as part of the Left and Right Journal when he spent some time after he grew weary of the old right guard, which we're going to speak about when I talk about conservatives, because of their friendliness with the war state and with monopoly privilege in general. He spent some time with the left, with the new left of the 60s and 70s, which was anti-establishment and rather revolutionary. It wasn't a conservative left. But regardless, this document, Left and Right and Prospects for Liberty, he lays out the dawn, the beginning, why we have the terms left and right in order to describe the polarization of political philosophy, and why we have the terms liberal and conservative as well. And the left and right dichotomy was established by the position of the seating of the members of the French Parliament right before the onset of the French Revolution. The radicals, for the most part, the liberals, sat on the left, and these were people that were interested in these liberal ideas, classical liberal ideas. And again, my appeal is that modern liberals still have a semblance of some of the aspects of classical liberalism. So these individuals sitting on the left had the ends. Their ends were almost exactly the same as libertarian ends today. They wanted to have equality under the law. Sure. They wanted to have decentralization, as do I, as do we. They wanted to have a higher standard of living for the masses, which falls by the wayside for some libertarians. And they also wanted to have peace, international peace, and finally free markets. They were for laissez-faire markets. That's the dawn of free market libertarianism. Free market anarchism was with the classical liberals pushing for less monopoly restrictions and privilege to the ruling class. On the right sat the conservatives, those who sought to conserve the status quo, which at the time was a monarchical, hierarchical regime, serfdom, feudalism. Only a small privileged class was beginning to take foot in the form of the merchants, and for the most part it was despotic, stagnant. There was a lot of despair, and they wanted to basically cement the status quo of feudalism and monarchy. So there was a clash, radicals and liberals versus the conservatives, right? Conservatives we'll get to towards the second part of the lecture. So what Rothbard goes on to say is that the classical liberals, unfortunately, as time went on, they began to lose their libertarian roots, and he attributes that to two things, the first of which is they abandoned their natural rights theory of self-ownership and property rights, and that being the root of the philosophy, and they began to take on a more utilitarian outlook on things, to where now that it will benefit more in the common good, it's okay if we violate the individual, if only for, in a little bit, if only a little bit. So they abandoned that. The second, which is many of them became social Darwinists, and they believed that it was be inevitable for them. They were the supreme optimists. They believed it would be inevitable that eventually everyone will just come around, and there'll be this enlightened little Nancy man that will walk around, and there'll be no risk and no harm for anybody ever. It'll just eventually become that way. So in that sense, they lost their radical creed, demanding total liberty all the time, and in all of their actions and all of their rhetoric. So slowly but surely they lost the way, and what happened was their ends are the same ends that we share today: peace, free markets, decentralization, a higher standard of living for the masses, and equality under the law. Their ends were freedom, basically. The means that they used back in the day were genuinely liberal ends. And at this point, Rothbard defines liberalism as those pushing for this society, and conservatism as those seeking to preserve the status quo, but also using the status quo, the power of the monopoly, to preserve itself, using the state, basically. So he said that the liberals had an inconsistency in their means and ends because they began to use statist ends, conservative ends, in order to achieve liberal statist ends and conservative means in order to achieve liberal ends. And it got all hijacked, and then pretty soon now the modern liberals today are seeking conservative ends as well. Many of them, they flip the script entirely. But the ones that we want to appeal to today are those modern liberals who still have some aspect and some semblance of classical liberalism. On the conservative side, we want to appeal to those modern conservatives who still have some semblance of paleo-conservatism. So, there's different aspects of classical liberalism, and again, when we speak in terms of their interests, we'll be able to further our cause, the cause of liberty, more effectively and more efficiently, because we won't arouse resentment in their mind because we're speaking about something that they're wholly disagreeing. Although there are some tactics that I'll cover briefly in order to overcome that, and to where you could come at someone that's totally you could push an end that they're totally opposed to. But if you speak in terms of one of the ends that they are in favor of and demonstrate how that could, and that means could bring about their end, then you could be successful. But sometimes it gets confusing to speak in means and ends. I've had that as a criticism before. So there's still some elements of modern liberals that throw back to classical liberalism. So let's explore those 5 different aspects of classical liberalism, and let's see if there's any that modern day liberals are still in favor of, and we can briefly discuss if there's been an evolution or a devolution away from these particular principles that was rooted in their original philosophy, classical liberalism. So let's do a modern liberal examination of those 5: equality under the law, free markets, higher standard of living for the masses, international peace, and oh man, I keep throwing myself off here. All right, we'll get to it whenever we get there. Okay, so the first one, equality under the law. Do liberals still stand for equality under the law? Well, what is equality under the law? It's basically the ideal that every man, having their natural rights, we all have the same natural rights. Whenever we enter into civil government, some laws shouldn't be enforced against a certain class or certain individuals, certain groups. Likewise, certain individuals shouldn't have privilege, right? It should be totally equal. Well, that was the case for quite some time, and equality in the law in many cases is just simply justice. But equality in the law deals with the social government, civil government. Unfortunately, it's been perverted, and there's been a devolution away from equality in the law in its original sense, which who could be against that? If you're for civil government, then it should be, or consensual government, it should be equal under the law. It devolved. It experienced some time in the civil rights movement. This was equality under the law, but now they threw the word civil and they've turned it into civil rights. This was also a devolution away from civil liberties that everybody shares. And the whole movement got turned into something about protecting the rights of a certain group, in this case African Americans. After that, civil rights was perverted into social justice. Not to say that these movements and this progression towards more freedom for everybody is something to frown upon. But I'm speaking to the aspect of how equality under the law, which is what it used to be all about, which was equality for everybody. We don't have to talk about class, socioeconomic status, or anything like that. Everybody, equality for everybody. It's been devolved. Then it had spent some time as a social justice movement. And a lot of social justice being the underprivileged communities should have the same access to social services as everyone else, and social services in general. And there's also a whole aspect of police brutality as well, which we all agree with, but again, that should be equality under the law as well. They shouldn't do it to white or African American populations. So there was further restrictions. Now they threw in the socioeconomic status especially. And now it's been devolved even further thanks to Agenda 21, international program under the United Nations in order to use environmentalism as a means to destroy our private property rights, dramatically alter the United States Constitution, our social, our cultural life, and also dramatically reduce the Earth's population. They've introduced this whole concept of social equity, which is really egalitarianism. Rothbard has another great article on egalitarianism. It's called Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature. You'll actually find the left and right and prospects for liberty that I referred to earlier is in a collection of essays called Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature. So I definitely recommend picking that up. But now they're trying to push social equity on us, which basically is all about every single individual should have the same ability, access, and we should be able to use force in order to help those that aren't as apt as others. And this is where you get into all sorts of nasty stuff. Basically, rob from Peter to pay Paul and help Paul with what he can't help himself to do. And so that's been a devolution. And so to illustrate what we have going on here, it started with equality in the law, which was for everybody, and it went all the way back to all the way down to social equity, where now there's all these different groups that it's talking about, and now it's gotten all the way to everybody needs to have a level playing field, not just level treatment in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the state and the government and the enforcement of the law. So, I mean, that one's kind of been eradicated. Some of the social justice folks that still exist, a lot of them bought into social equity, but for the most part, they'll still appeal to this equality under the law. This isn't, I'm not sure if this is necessarily one of the planks of the 5 that we can necessarily go after in a major way. If you do, always remind the modern liberals that, hey man, it doesn't matter about a particular class or a particular race. This is the way that it should be for everybody. And then here's how you throw a kink in them and create cognitive dissonance. That's one of the objectives of whenever you can speak towards an end that they're not necessarily in favor of. You create cognitive dissonance inside of their mind. It's a tactic in order to get them to hopefully wake up to what you're trying to push. But you can create cognitive dissonance in their mind by telling them that in order to pull off the social equity that you call for, creating egalitarianism, you have to unequally treat a producer, someone in the productive class, by taking them, by thieving from them, by taxing them. That's unequal protection of the law, because here we have the law being used to set up a privilege for one individual who may not be able to produce for himself or has no one to provide for them by taking away from one of the producers. So now you're taking from this one with the law. On the reverse side of the law, you're giving to this one. That's inequality of the law. Okay, so equality in the law, we've kind of delved away from that one. Decentralization. Now, here's one that we commonly have problems with when it comes to conservatives as well, and that's because whenever their person in power, whenever the Republicans in power, they're okay with centralization. They're okay with a strong, powerful president and a strong, powerful Congress. And right now, modern liberals are okay with a strong, powerful president, Barack Obama, because they were forced to drink the Kool-Aid and they've bought into him entirely. So in many instances, they're not for decentralization as much as they would be. However, there's many progressives that do favor the idea of a local autonomous community. So while you may not be able to get them on the states' rights, which is on the flip side what the conservatives are appealed to in the decentralization aspect at this particular moment, you can get them on the idea of local autonomous communities, and they're going to be in favor of sustainability, which is giving future generations the same access to resources that the current generation has. That's a whole other thing about social equity as well, which sounds like a noble thing unless you're using force to achieve it, which the current paradigm is. But you can appeal to them, and you can appeal to decentralization by talking in terms of another one of their ends right now, which is sustainability. And you can say, hey, what better way to go green than to supply food from local farms, or to give contracts to local firms, to decentralize? What better way to help our community grow and to live healthily and to protect the environment than to give contracts to local firms and to assist local firms, to work with local firms, to build local community sustainable gardens? That's a way to get them on decentralization, because they've drifted away from it. But many elements of the more green, progressive, a lot of anarchists have communes, and they all grow food. That's a very big overlap that we share with them also, the food growing as well. So there's an opportunity to reach out to those communities and to sell them on the philosophy of liberty. But a lot of the modern liberals, your typical Democrats, they're not going to favor decentralization too well. But then again, you can mix in some cognitive dissonance and say, hey, well, we want to reduce all this carbon that's coming out. Why not support local produce? Of course, you don't want to impose economic restrictions in order to subsidize that local produce, because then now you're using statist means in order to achieve liberal ends, as I stated before, and that would be a fallacy. Okay, so equality under the law, higher standard of living equality under the law, decentralization. Now here's a big one, higher standard of living for the masses. This one's really big because modern day liberals are all about it. And it's really quite sad because those that are most in favor of helping out the poor, those who are most in favor of putting a gun to your head in order to help out the poor, sometimes are the ones that aren't doing a damn thing for themselves. But the way that you appeal To those who desire a higher standard of living for masses, this will also be a lesson for the libertarian movement, something that I've noticed, is to demonstrate to them, and now I'll bring in the fourth component, free markets, which they're not in favor of at all. They've lost all semblances of free market. The modern liberals, even though that was a major tenet, laissez-faire, Frederick Bastiat really espoused it quite well, of the classical liberals. The modern liberals totally lost this. So here's a way where you can use something that they're totally in favor of, a higher standard of living for the masses, where you can use this end in order to get them to buy into this end. So everybody knows, liberals know, that the greatest way to increase the living standard for everyone is free markets. They naturally fulfill the ends and the desires of individuals. The market and the individual is the best at deciding how goods and resources should be allocated. That market naturally decides it for itself. For those of you who studied Austrian economics, then a lot of these arguments kick into play. So basically you make the argument to the liberal, hey man, I agree with you. I would like to see a higher standard of living for the masses all across the globe, but especially in my community. And one thing that I've noticed is that, the war on poverty, all these social programs, they're not reducing poverty. Poverty's grown, just as it has with the war on drugs, more drug use, war on terror, more terrorism. The war on poverty is a failure. You see, what happens is these institutions, they like to cement themselves by ensuring that they'll have an operating budget, ensuring that there'll be people on poverty, people using food stamps and welfare checks in order to cement that, not to mention naturally holds people down because it doesn't allow them the opportunity to realize that they need to get their act together. But you can demonstrate to them how if there were less regulations and restrictions, more individuals would be able to start businesses of their own. They'd be able to run them out of their house if they didn't have to move or rent a place because there's zoning restrictions for them doing things in their homes. They would be able to start that business if they didn't have to go through licenses and pay $300 and $1,000 and potentially hire an accountant to file it because it takes a certain amount of knowledge to do that. They wouldn't have to increase their taxes because they're bringing in new income. If we had a free market, these people would be able to do that, and they would be able to then lift their living standard. Likewise, you can push back on centralized corporations who betray free markets, imposing regulations, helping the big guys, shutting down local factories, local plants, reducing the standard of living for the masses. And then another one they might counter and say, hey, well, what about the factories, the slave wages? That's what a free market brought us. It brought a bunch of slave labor. You can always demonstrate, on the contrary, the individuals that worked in the factories during the onset of the Industrial Revolution, which was caused by a lot of free markets, besides some of the robber baron stuff that took foot a little bit later. It was a genuinely free market and free market ideals and ideas that got out there freely, not just under the monarchical privilege. It was a free market that allowed all these people that flocked to these factories a higher living standard. Before, it was total sustenance. Many of them were starving. They had no home over their heads, family, dozens and dozens of people were living in the same home. They were offered this low wage, but it was better. They took it voluntarily, and the free market actually led to the dramatic rise in the standard of living that we experienced in the Western world because of the free market, right? So those two tossed in together. So we've had equality in the law. They've drifted away from it towards social equity. You can still appeal to it by trying to remove the barriers and pointing out that it's unequal for them to take from Paul to give to Peter. The second was decentralization. They're all about centralization when they're in power. I guarantee it. States' rights issues will be nullification of real ID, for example. Under Bush, they were okay with states' rights at that particular point. But you can still appeal to the progressives and many of the anti-establishment left by going back towards local autonomous communities, sustainable. There's a movement called the Transition Movement for Local Resiliency. I'm on a couple of their Yahoo groups, and a lot of it's cloaked in socialism, but they're hardcore for decentralization, local farmers markets and stuff like that, which is something we can get engaged in too. Higher standard of living for the masses. They're totally in favor of it, but they use statist ends to achieve the liberal means. We need to remind them that we need to be consistent in our means, the free market, to achieve the end of higher standard of living for the masses. And you can sell and undermine their disbelief in the free market by pointing out that it's actually the privilege that larger firms get by using state regulations to outdo their competition because they can afford the extra accounting, for example, That's not a free market. We don't live in a free market. If we did live in a free market, you would find that individuals' wants and needs would be fulfilled a lot easier and a lot cheaper, more affordable. But check out Austrian Economics if you want to get a lot of arguments from LewRockwell.com as well on why the market works. And then finally, international peace. I mean, I guess this gets back to whenever everybody's so bought into this Democrat and Republican thing that whenever your guy gets in office, he naturally marches on with the war. He will continue doing all of that good stuff, and they'll just buy into it. I actually spoke with a woman today at a coffee shop. It was Starbucks, so how's that for an inconsistency in my decentralization there? But stopped in, and this woman had an Obama shirt, and I just asked her, I said, what do you think about Barack Obama's recent invasion of Libya? She, I'm opposed to it, but I agree with it at the same time, because, I mean, we can't go at it alone. And then she pointed out she heard a joke on the radio, and they said, Obama must be checking out Amazon.com, and it says, for those of you who bomb this those that bombed this country, we're also likely to bomb this country down here. That's the joke we left. But she still wears his shirt, and she still, said yes and no. I was going to ask her about Pakistan unmanned aerial drones, so I guess you could appeal to the cognitive dissonance. In order to bring them back towards international peace, appeal towards cognitive dissonance, put cognitive dissonance in their minds, and just question them about Obama. A lot of them are in favor of Obama. And then again, you'll find there's still a radical anti-establishment element that is opposed to the war. They did demonstrations down here in Austin recently. There's a bunch of Bradley Manning demonstrations, so you can always work with them. They share the same ends. But in order to get to the modern liberals who abandoned international peace as a fighting creed, I would recommend trying to create cognitive dissonance in their minds by pointing out that the person that they follow, Barry Obama, once was opposed to war, now he's in favor, blah, blah, blah. So that's modern liberalism. It's drifted away in certain aspects from its roots, philosophical roots, which are also libertarianism's philosophical roots. It's drifted away in many aspects, and it's been strengthened in others, like social equity. Just appeal it. Get them to bring it back to equality in the law. They've abandoned decentralization for the most part. That'll change when Bush takes office. Sell them on states' rights, on Real ID and Patriot Act, stuff like that. Higher standard of living for the masses. This is what they're all about these days. And they're all about taking your money to do it. You can demonstrate to them free markets are the way to go on that one. And again, international peace. Try to create cognitive dissonance through the use of pointing out Barry Obama was against the war, and you were once against the war as well. You can also point out how it's harming innocence and it's lowering the standard of living. So if you wanted to appeal back to one of the things that they're in favor of, how, well, the UN sanctions over Iraq killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians and permanently destroyed the living standard of that country. We're doing bombing raids in Libya right now. You can bet your dollar we're not going to stick around to help them rebuild. Not that we should, but like we did after Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghanistan war. Because we're not at international peace, which they're not as much in favor of, appeal to those ends that they are in favor of, speak in terms of their interests. It's destroying the standard of living for Middle Easterners all across the Middle East. So that's the classical liberalism. We've drifted away from it. We can still go back to it. And I've found that it's a lot easier to influence liberals. It's harder when there's a Democrat in office. But it's easier sometimes because, for the most part, the philosophical roots of liberalism and conservatism, we share those ends. Another dichotomy between the two differences, liberals seek to change things, radical change in some instances. Conservatives seek to conserve things. Most radical libertarians, real libertarians, seek to change things. They're radical. They're not conservatives. That's why this whole meshing has kind of hindered us. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that. But you can really appeal to the liberals, and sometimes it's a little smoother because it's more easy to demonstrate how the state is unable and incapable of achieving the ends that we all share. Whereas the conservatives, their roots were genuinely about conserving the status quo and monopoly privilege. That's why so many of them today, they love to suck at the teat of the state in order to further their ideal of what change should be. But the change is, I should be the one deciding it for everybody, back to monopoly. So they're still conserving it. Okay, so modern conservatives. Republican Party, a lot of Tea Party folks. Tea Party, there's definitely a lot of areas to reach. But so when appealing to modern liberals, I ask you to go back to the values of classical liberalism that we all share. Whenever you're appealing to conservatives, I ask you to go back to the paleo-conservative days of the old right, where there were many instances, for the most part, where their philosophy overlapped libertarianism. So what are the ends of paleoconservatism? You have states' rights, which is decentralization. That's the form that it took. You had non-interventionism with Senator somebody help me out with the senator that was big on states' rights during the old right, and he opposed FDR's intervention into World War II. Ron Paul was a big supporter of his as well, as a U.S. senator. So they were for non-intervention. They thought that the United States of government should have a non-interventionist foreign policy. Additionally, they were for laissez-faire markets, the paleo-conservatives, the old right. It was a faction of the right that grew wary of Woodrow Wilson, and they were opposed to FDR and their monopoly capitalism, the progressivism, and the FDR fascist policies. They opposed all of that, and they formed their own little faction, and they were pushing back, and they had genuine libertarian ends for the most part. Laissez-faire markets was another one. So it's non-interventionism, states' rights. They were opposed to welfare and social programs. They were for laissez-faire markets, and they favored the Second Amendment in large part, paleo-conservatism. Although this wasn't one of their fighting creeds, I just throw it in there because it's something that sticks with most genuine conservatives that have a libertarian twist. They're all for the Second Amendment, which of course helps to preserve individual liberty. Okay, so non-interventionism, they have drifted in very large part away from that. Actually, let's take that back. I'm going to replace Second Amendment with spending. I'm going to replace Second Amendment with spending. Back in the day, the conservatives, just like many of the conservatives today, they just talk a big game. They were favoring low spending, balanced budgets, no debt. Okay, so non-interventionism, they faded away the modern conservatives in a very major way outside of just the Ron Paul Republicans. But even the modern Tea Party, that's still the issue that they can't come on. So let's hop to the last issue that the conservatives, paleo-conservatives favor, libertarian-style conservatism favors, which is kind of an oxymoron, is low spending, balanced budgets, low taxes. So in order to appeal to an end that they no longer share, non-interventionists, modern liberals, hit them with one that they do share in a very major way, and which was the very essence and the root of the Tea Party. So you see this occurring with Ron Paul and Rand Paul especially, who I was quite the critic of. I still criticize his means, but I do appreciate having another Paul in there to spread the message and to create cognitive dissonance in the minds of those who would listen to him, the modern conservatives, the Tea Party, because they'll sit back and be like, well, wait a second. You really mean we're spending $1 trillion over there? $1 trillion a month? I think it's $1 trillion a month. A little while ago, we were spending $1 trillion a month. You're like, man, no wonder the budget's so jacked up. No wonder we have this national debt, which they just spoke against. So there's one where you can appeal. They're still in favor of the balanced budgets, low taxes, low spending. They're not in favor of non-intervention, but you can use the one that they are in favor of in order to appeal the one they're not in favor of. States' rights strengthened massively. The Tea Party movement is way into nullification, which I believe to be uniquely radical because it's basically pitting one level of government against another, trying to force it to stand up to its supposed creed to protect our individual life, liberty, and property, and basically creating a little counterintelligence program where now they're combating each other and butting heads. Hopefully it doesn't lead to a civil war. But rather than violating your rights, now they're focused on fighting each other. That's why I'm a fan of nullification. It also represents decentralization. At one time, the states were supposedly consensual if you were a privileged aristocratic property owning man. But the way that it ought to be, if we were to engage in civil government, would be this decentralized form, preferably some sort of confederation as opposed to a central a central government that's a democracy, if we were to have a republic. So states' rights, yeah, I've been touring with the Nullify Now. The Foundation for a Free Society is a big sponsor of those events with Michael Bolden, Bryce Shonka, the 10th Amendment Center, and man, these conservatives are eating up states' rights. So it gives us the opportunity to bring up nullification, bring up the 10th Amendment, and say, yeah, isn't it a great idea to decentralize authority? I mean, why stop at the state level? States' rights, what's that all about? Governments don't have rights. Individuals have rights, right? And governments, in fact, are instituted in order to protect our individual rights. Government hasn't been doing that for a while. What's up with that? What's this idea of consensual government? It goes from there. Before you know it, you're talking about anarchism and free markets using the service of provision of defense and justice or whatnot. So states' rights is big time. Another way to go back, see the interventionism that they're not in favor of, appeal to states' rights and say, wait a second, that's not the job of the National Guard. This is unconstitutional. What are we doing here? Why we should pull our National Guard troops back to protect us, right? Okay, anti-welfare. There's been somewhat of a drift in the modern conservatives away from anti-social programs, and that's you can see that in the fact that George Bush signed and passed the largest expansion of socialized medicine since LBJ's Great Society. This is another way, again, to point out and cognitively divide and create cognitive dissonance and pull the modern conservatives out of the Republican Party or out of belief, blind loyalty to conservatism by saying, wait a second, I thought you guys were against social programs, social welfare. You're totally just giving, all of this money is theft, and you just expanded medicine. You're against Obamacare, but you're in favor of Bush when he expanded Medicare and Medicaid. Another way to do it is always appeal to, and this is something that modern conservatives do, that the leaders of the parties do, the Republicans and the Democrats, and that's corporate welfare. Tea Partiers should all be opposed to corporate welfare. That's a great way to appeal them, and then it presents an opportunity for you to demonstrate how the monopoly state helps privileged businesses and helps its buddies in order to destroy the free market, which they're still in favor of, which is the next point, laissez-faire free markets. They're still in favor of laissez-faire free markets for the most part. Here's yet another opportunity for you to create cognitive dissonance in the minds of conservatives, to influence them over to the cause of liberty. I might add that he doesn't necessarily recommend cognitive dissonance. He always talks about being as genuine and sincere as possible, but I know how well cognitive dissonance works in awakening people to the inconsistencies of their ideology or their blind loyalty to an ideology or to a political party. And it's subtle, but it happens whenever you just naturally do as Dale Carnegie recommends to do, speak in terms of other people's interests. So another way to get them to speak in favor of against non-interventionism is to demonstrate the military-industrial complex and how much of a burden that is in our economy, on our national debt, and how that's monopoly privilege going towards interventionism. So, this is hurting our economy here. You should be against this too, right? And finally, it was going to be the spending. The Tea Party and many modern conservatives are in favor of balanced budgets, very low spending. So again, that's a way to appeal to the non-intervention that they're not in favor of. It also provides an opportunity to attack programs that should not be done. And another thing you can do is preach black market or counter-economic, or allowing individuals and communities to take care of particular services. It's a great way to reach these modern conservatives on reducing the state dramatically, doing away with police departments, for example, to say, hey, do you know how much money we would save on this year's budget and how many taxes would be reduced if we simply did away with the police department and we all protected ourselves, or we worked with private defense agencies? I mean, come on. So that's another way to further the cause of libertarianism. So I guess I'm coming up on the end of my lecture. As I said, these are a bunch of ideas that I've been putting down, began to put down on paper. That should be in a more concrete fashion, but I believe it's something that can really assist as a big tool. I have a little chart laid out, and it can be a good tool. You sit there, you become genuinely interested in someone, which is one of his first tips, and you find out what their ends are, what motivates them, what they are trying to achieve. You compare that with your individual philosophy, that of libertarianism, and whenever you find areas of common interest, you focus on furthering those particular areas as opposed to butting heads about what you don't agree with. You won't arise resentment, and you'll find that you can genuinely work with those other individuals. So I hope that this harmonizing is one aspect of that, and I hope to put together a tool where we can really easily see what has worked, what hasn't, maybe even put a matrix on it, put a forum behind it as well, so people can give examples. And I'd like people to also, Robert Taft, that's exactly who it is, Senator Robert Taft. If people want to give examples of how they've used the Carnegie method, harmonizing with the left and right, in order to reach out across the aisle or reach out to modern liberals and conservatives, things that they speak in favor of that modern liberals and conservatives are also in favor of. So speak in terms of the other people's interests, and you won't arise resentment, and you'll find that you can work together. And now here's where Rothbardian single-issue coalition building comes into play. There's a piece that he wrote called Sell Out and Die. Murray Rothbard's Sell Out and Die. And he says that the libertarians should seek to create single-issue coalitions that center around the inner cadre, the tight inner cadre. There's also another piece he has about libertarian strategy where he defines a pyramid. And he says the inner cadre is at the top. Those are the pure, consistent libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, all the way 100% consistent in their means and ends. It's a small, united clique for the beginning, 10 people, 20 people, it grows. Below them are the libertarians that, they're halfway there. In this category, you may find some Ron Paul Republicans, many of the minarchists. But your goal, your job is to bring them up to the cadre of hardcore radical, the agorist cadre, the anarcho-capitalists, right? Below that would be maybe the Tea Party activists who are halfway there. Along them, some of the genuinely anti-establishment progressives, anti-establishment lefties. Below them, your typical modern liberal and modern Democrat, but below them the general public who doesn't care. Oh, actually, I guess it would go down towards fascism. So now you're at statists down here, hardcore statists, even though most of the people except for the top are statists, technically. So the idea is to work them up. And the way that he says that you can work them up the pyramid, and the reason why single-issue coalition works and why harmonizing and why working with these other political ideologies works is because the consistency, this is what he says in Sell Out and Die, the consistency of libertarianism, that's why I value libertarianism, because it's the only consistent political philosophy, will naturally wear off on both parties. So I don't recommend starting a Libertarian Party or joining the Republican Party, especially, like so many libertarians tend to do. All you do is you work with your little cadre, call it a group, call it your little crew, whatever you want, Free State Project, Texans for Accountable Government, the Central Texas Freedom Fighters, whatever. It can be as loose as possible. Have a united cadre that's as consistent as possible. You're working down the middle. You have 48% here and 48% here. You're the 2% in the middle. You go through as consistent. You build value based on shared values, based on the harmonization we spoke of, on those issues. And all the while, you preach to them and you give them your libertarian talking points. And slowly you'll find that the fringes of these two liberal, modern conservatives, slowly you'll find that the fringes of these parties and of these collective ideologies will slowly start joining you. First, you'll be able to pick off 2% from the 48% and 2% from the 48%. Now you're 6% marching forward, and they're 46% marching forward. Boom, boom, boom. You're advancing down the line because you're working with these individuals on both sides on the areas of common interest. And because you're radical libertarians and you don't have to kowtow to anybody, and you're genuinely anti-state, and your means are genuinely consistent with your ends because you're genuinely trying to create a free society, and you know that any state institution or any state action will not help the individual, it will only further serve to harm the individual, you're going to be more successful, your activism is going to be better because it works, and people are going to see that. So just keep cruising. Don't join one side or the other. Keep cruising. People can be moles if they want. Sometimes that helps to pick them off. Create the cognitive dissonance. Build the value based on shared values where our philosophies overlap. And before you know it, our little tight, united libertarian cadre will now be 20, 25%. When we get the majority, at that point, if we stick to our consistency in means and ends and our liberal ends, and we create our private defense agencies, we'll be able to outcompete the state. All the while, we'll be outcompeting the state. And once we're able to overcome it, it will simply dwindle away and peacefully have a nice, sad death. And in order to do that, we can educate those that are modern liberals and modern conservatives who believe the state will save their day. In order to more effectively do it, I recommend you read How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I've just barely tapped the tip of the iceberg on the potential that the tactics and strategies laid out in this book have to increase your ability to more effectively spread the philosophy of liberty. So check this out. Also check out Foundation for a Free Society, myfreesociety.com. A lot of stuff I've discussed today. A lot of Murray Rothbard. You'll find the article about libertarian strategies actually on our front page, so check that out. Texans for Accountable Government, tagtexas.org, myfreesociety.com. Soon enough, I'll have this paper put down, all these ideas put down in a more concise manner, and then we'll pump out some videos. This will be here up on YouTube. So again, I want to give a big thanks to George Donnelly, day number 2. It's been a great success. A lot of people really like what you got going. I've seen some of the YouTubes that I missed, and I can't wait to watch more. Thank you, George Donnelly, Ethan Lee Vita, everybody that made this Agora.io possible. I look forward to participating in future ones. And again, speak in terms of their interests, find common ground, appeal to those areas where modern liberals and modern conservatives still have a little semblance of throwback to classical liberalism and paleoconservatism, and together we will build a free and prosperous society. Peacing out. I guess that's my time. I'll be hanging in the little chat room if anybody has any questions or comments. Agora.io. Peace, freedom, liberty.